She laughed at me, right on the phone, like I was some kind of joke she was tired of pretending to take seriously. And the worst part? She was right about one thing. I didn't say a word back. Not a single word. Because in that moment, standing in my kitchen with my phone in my hand and my coffee going cold on the counter, I understood something she didn't. That silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is the only dignified answer a man has left. My name is Harold Mackenzie. I'm 76 years old. I spent 41 years as a marine engineer, most of them out on the water or down in engine rooms that smelled like diesel and salt and honest labor. I retired here in Victoria, British Columbia, because Eleanor always loved it. My wife, she passed 5 years ago, and after that, well, I stayed, because leaving would have felt like losing her a second time. I live in a small apartment on Montreal Street, right here in James Bay. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, one of which I don't open anymore because that's where I keep her things. My window looks out over the inner harbor, and on clear mornings you can see the ferries crossing, slow and steady, like they've got all the time in the world. I like that view. It reminds me that some things just keep moving, no matter what. My pension isn't much. After 41 years, I'd hoped for more, but the shipping company I worked for went through restructuring twice in the 90s, and my benefits took a hit both times. What I get is enough to cover rent, groceries, my prescriptions, and 2 cups of decent coffee a week at Mocha House on Government Street. That's not a complaint. That's just the truth. I learned a long time ago to live within what I have, and I never built the habit of wanting more than I needed. Every first Friday of the month, my pension lands in my account, right around 8 in the morning. I check it on my phone. My son Andrew set it up so I could see my balance without going to the bank every time. And then I put my jacket on and walk down to the cafe. It's a ritual. Small, I know. But when you're 76 and living alone, rituals are what hold the days together. That particular Friday was the 6th of the month, November. One of those mornings in Victoria where the sky can't make up its mind. Patches of pale blue between heavy gray clouds, the kind of light that makes the harbor look like a painting someone started and never finished. I remember I was standing by my kitchen window, checking my phone before heading out, and I saw the deposit had come in, the usual amount. I took a breath and reached for my coat, and then my phone refreshed. I don't know why it refreshed right then. Maybe I bumped something. Maybe the app just updated on its own. But I looked down again and the number had changed. Dropped. Not a small adjustment, the kind of thing that might be a fee or a rounding difference, but a real drop. Most of what had just arrived was already gone. I stood there for probably a full minute just looking at it. My first thought was that the bank had made some kind of error. That happens, you hear about it. A system glitch, a duplicate withdrawal, something like that. These things get sorted out. I told myself not to panic, that I'd call customer service and they'd walk me through it, and by the end of the day it would be fixed. I was reaching for the number when my phone rang. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, Andrew's wife. They've been married for 16 years. She's 46, works in finance, manages accounts, handles investments, that sort of thing. She and Andrew live out in Saanich, nice house. She handles their money and, apparently, had been handling some of mine as well. I picked up. Harold. Not a question. Just my name, the way you say something you were expecting to deal with eventually. Vanessa, I said, and then she laughed. Not a big laugh, just this light, casual sound, like she was telling me something obvious. She said, "Don't worry, Harold. I moved the money where it can actually be useful. You're retired. What do you even need all that for?" I didn't answer. She kept going. Her tone was almost kind, the way you talk to someone when you've already decided the conversation doesn't really require their input. She said, "Go ahead, hire a lawyer if you want. Nobody takes an old man's memory seriously anymore." Then she hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that. The coffee was cold. The harbor outside was doing that thing it does when the tide is low, where the light hits the water at a shallow angle, and everything goes very still and very flat. I looked at it for a while. Then I put my phone in my pocket, picked up my coat, and walked out the door. I didn't call Andrew. I didn't call the bank. I didn't tell my neighbor Clarence, who would have been furious on my behalf and probably would have gone over there personally, which would have made things worse. I walked down to Mocha House, ordered my coffee, sat by the window, and watched the street. I want to be honest with you about something. I know what you're expecting right now. You're expecting me to tell you I went home and started making calls, that I was furious, that I wanted revenge. And I understand that expectation, because that's the logical response when someone takes what's yours and then laughs about it. But I've lived 76 years. I've worked in engine rooms where one wrong decision could sink a vessel. I've buried my wife. I've watched friendships end and money disappear and plans collapse. And what I've learned, what those years burned into me, is that the worst thing you can do in a dangerous situation is move before you understand the full shape of it. So I sat with my coffee and I thought. I thought about the number I'd seen on my screen. I thought about how Vanessa had called before I could even dial customer service, which meant she'd been watching, which meant this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding, which meant she had done this on purpose and expected either nothing or a brief, forgettable argument she could manage. I thought about what she had said, about how nobody takes an old man's memory seriously anymore. And I thought about how specific that phrase was. That's not something you say off the top of your head. That's something you've thought about, something you've maybe reassured yourself with, quietly, while you were doing something you already knew was wrong. I finished my coffee and walked back toward James Bay along Dallas Road. If you've never walked Dallas Road in November, I'll tell you, it's one of the best things about living here. The wind off the strait is cold and clean, and Beacon Hill Park is on one side and the water is on the other, and there aren't many tourists this time of year, so you mostly have it to yourself. I've walked that road hundreds of times. With Eleanor, before she got sick. Alone, after. It's where I go when I need to think without anyone asking me what I'm thinking about. By the time I got home, I had made one decision. I was going to do this right, whatever this was, and I had the feeling it was more than one transferred payment. I was going to do it right. No shouting. No accusations over the phone. No family dinners turned into courtrooms. I've seen what that kind of confrontation does to people. It makes them defensive. It makes them dig in. It gives the guilty party a reason to cry victim and muddy everything that ought to be clear. No, I was going to find someone who knew how to navigate this kind of thing. Now, I should tell you something about how you find a lawyer in Victoria when you're 76, and you've never needed one for anything more complicated than updating your will. You ask around, quietly. You don't post on the internet asking for recommendations, because then everyone in your circle knows your business. You think carefully about who you know who has dealt with something serious and come out the other side with their dignity intact, and you call them. I thought about a man named Gerald Fitch, who had worked on the docks with me in the 80s and had gone through a long dispute with a contractor over back pay. He'd come out of it all right, and he'd mentioned the name of the lawyer who had handled it. I still had Gerald's number in my phone. Andrew had transferred all my old contacts when I got a new phone 2 years ago, which I was grateful for now. I called Gerald that evening. He picked up on the third ring, surprised to hear from me. We talked for a few minutes about nothing, the weather, a fishing trip he'd taken over the summer. And then I asked him, as casually as I could manage, if he remembered the name of the lawyer he'd used back in the day. He said, Margaret Sullivan, still practicing, I think, over near Cook Street Village. Sharp as a tack, Harold. Doesn't waste your time. Margaret Sullivan. I wrote it down. I didn't call her that night. I looked her name up, confirmed she was still practicing, and then I went to bed. I lay there for a while, listening to the harbor. On quiet nights, you can hear the water from my apartment, just barely. And I thought about Eleanor. I thought about what she would have said if I'd told her. Probably something like, "Well, you're not going to let that stand." Not angry, just certain. Eleanor had that quality. She didn't dramatize things. She just saw them clearly and moved. I made an appointment with Margaret Sullivan the following Monday morning. Her office was on a side street off Cook Street Village, in one of those older Victoria buildings that looks modest from the outside, but has high ceilings and good wood inside. The kind of building that's been quietly useful for decades, without needing to announce itself. I liked that immediately. The assistant at the front desk was a man in his 50s who offered me tea, which I accepted, and Margaret came out to meet me about 5 minutes later. She was 68, tall, silver hair pulled back, and she moved like someone who had long ago stopped proving herself to anyone. She shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and said, "Mr. Mackenzie, come in and tell me what happened." So I did. I told her everything from the beginning. The pension, the phone call, what Vanessa had said, word for word, as best as I could remember it. I told her I hadn't said anything to Andrew yet. I told her I didn't know how long this had been going on, whether this was one incident or something that had been building over time. I told her about the phrase Vanessa had used, about old men's memories. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the legal pad where she'd been writing notes. Then she said, "Mr. Mackenzie, what you're describing could be a single incident, or it could be part of a pattern. Before we file anything, before we say anything to anyone, I want to see everything. Bank records going back as far as you can get them. Every statement, every authorization you may have signed, every email or voicemail related to your finances, every record of communication with Vanessa or Andrew about money. Everything." I asked her how long that would take. She said, "A few weeks at least, maybe longer. The picture has to be complete before we act, because once we act, we can't take it back." I told her I understood. She looked at me carefully for a moment. "Most people who come to me in your situation want to file something the same day. They want the anger to go somewhere immediately." I said, "I'm not angry. I'm 76 years old. I don't have the energy to waste on being angry at the right time." She smiled, just slightly, and wrote something else on her pad. We talked for another hour. She walked me through what she would need, how she would request the records, what the process looked like if this turned out to be what she suspected. She was careful not to promise anything or overstate what we knew, but she also didn't soften it unnecessarily. When I left her office and walked back through Cook Street Village toward home, the afternoon had cleared a little. The trees along the street had mostly lost their leaves by then, but there's something about Cook Street in November that stays alive anyway. The coffee shop, the bookstore, the older residents moving at their own pace, unhurried and unimpressed by anything that isn't genuinely worth their time. I've always liked that neighborhood. It has a certain dignity that doesn't require explanation. I stopped at the Italian bakery on the corner and bought a loaf of bread, which I didn't particularly need, but which seemed like the right thing to do. Then I walked home along Government Street, past the shops already putting up their early holiday decorations, past tourists with their cameras pointed at the Empress Hotel, past the buskers near the Inner Harbor, who play even in the cold, because some people just need to play. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and began writing down everything I could remember. Every conversation about money I'd had with Vanessa over the past several years. Every time she had offered to help manage something. Every form I might have signed without reading carefully enough, because she had explained it quickly and I had trusted her because she was my son's wife. And you don't approach your family like they're trying to deceive you. You just don't. That's not how decent people operate, and I had spent my whole life assuming I was surrounded by decent people. I wrote for 2 hours. When I finished, I had 4 pages of notes, some of them clear and some of them uncertain, with question marks next to dates I couldn't remember exactly. I put them in a folder. I put the folder in my desk, and then I went back to living my life. because that was the plan. Margaret had been clear about that, too, that the best thing I could do during the weeks while she gathered information was to behave exactly as I always did. Nothing unusual, no sudden changes in routine, no conversations that could be quoted back later as evidence of me making accusations without proof. Morning walks along Dallas Road, conversations with Clarence and the other neighbors in the building lobby. My volunteer work at the community center over on Hillside. I'd been repairing antique clocks there for 3 years, something I'd picked up after Eleanor died, because I needed something that required precision and patience, and gave me a reason to leave the apartment twice a week. Coffee at Mocha House, evenings by the window watching the harbor go dark. I called Andrew twice during those weeks, normal calls. How are you? How's work? Did you see the forecast? Says we might get some early snow. He sounded fine. He sounded like himself, and I sat there listening to my son's voice and thinking about the conversation I was going to have with him eventually, and what that might do to him. And I felt something that had nothing to do with anger at all. It felt more like grief. Because here's what nobody tells you about being deceived by someone inside your own family. The money is one thing. The money you can replace, or try to, or find a way to live without. What you can't easily replace is the version of events you believed was true, the story you told yourself about your own life, about who the people around you were, about how you were seen, about what your decades of work meant to the people who were supposed to be closest to you. That's what hurts in a way that doesn't show up in any legal document. I thought about that a lot during those weeks. I thought about it on the bench near the Rose Garden in Beacon Hill Park, where Eleanor and I used to sit on Sunday afternoons in the summer. I thought about it while I was working on a Seth Thomas mantel clock at the community center, carefully extracting a mainspring that someone had wound too tight for too many years without anyone noticing. And one evening, while I was cleaning the clock's face with a soft cloth, one of the other volunteers, a retired schoolteacher named Patrick, who had a habit of saying things that sounded simple, but turned out to mean more than you expected, looked over at what I was doing and said, "You know, with old clocks, the damage isn't usually what broke them. It's what people kept doing after it broke that made it worse." I thought about that for a long time. About 2.5 weeks after my first meeting with Margaret, she called and asked me to come back in. Her voice on the phone was calm, which I'd already learned was just how she was. But there was something underneath it, something careful and deliberate, that told me she had found something worth talking about. I told her I'd be there first thing the next morning. I hung up and stood by my window for a while. The harbor was doing what it always does in the evening, filling up with reflected light, the water going gold and then gray and then dark as the sun dropped, behind the Olympic Mountains across the strait. A ferry was crossing in the distance, slow and steady, its lights just starting to show. And I thought, Margaret found something. The question wasn't whether I was ready to hear it. The question was how much bigger this was going to turn out to be. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was afraid exactly, more because there's a particular kind of alertness that comes over you when you know something is about to change, and your mind won't settle into rest the way it normally does. I lay there listening to the harbor and thinking about Margaret's voice on the phone. Calm, careful, the way someone sounds when they've opened a door and seen something larger than the room they expected to walk into. I got up at 5:30, earlier than usual, made coffee, stood at my window and watched the sky over the harbor go from black to the kind of dark blue that only exists for about 20 minutes before the real light starts. There's a ferry that crosses early, before most people are awake, and I watched its lights moving across the water in that strange pre-dawn quiet. I've always liked that hour. Eleanor used to say I was the only person she knew who actually enjoyed the very beginning of the day, before it had any obligations attached to it. I put on my good wool coat, the dark gray one I bought in Aberdeen years ago, on a job in the North Sea, and I walked down to a bakery on Government Street that opens at 6 and serves coffee that's actually worth drinking at that hour. I sat there for a while with a cup and the newspaper, not reading it so much as holding it, giving my hands something to do while my mind worked on its own. By the time I walked into Margaret's office, it was just past 9 o'clock. She was already at her desk when her assistant brought me in. There was a file on the desk in front of her, not a thin one, and she had her reading glasses on, which she took off when I sat down. She looked at me the way doctors sometimes look at you when they're deciding how to begin, not stalling, just choosing the right door in. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Mackenzie," she said. "Harold," I told her. I'd said it twice before, but it hadn't stuck yet. She nodded, almost smiling. "Harold, I want to go through what I've found carefully, because I don't want you to hear a number and react to the number before you understand the full picture. Is that all right?" I said it was. She opened the file. What Margaret had found, working through 3 years of my banking records, alongside the financial authorization documents that Vanessa had submitted on various occasions, was not one transfer. It was not 2 or 3. It was a pattern, a quiet, methodical, almost patient pattern that had started small, $200 here, $300 there, labeled on documentation as temporary family reimbursement or shared expense adjustment, and had grown incrementally over time, the way something grows when it's never challenged, and the person doing it begins to feel safe. Margaret walked me through it, month by month, not rushing, not editorializing, just laying documents on the desk in front of me, one after another, and explaining what each one showed. There were authorization forms I had signed. I remembered signing some of them, vaguely, in contexts that had seemed entirely reasonable at the time. Vanessa explaining that she needed my signature for a joint family account that would make certain shared expenses easier to manage, a form for what she described as a supplemental investment arrangement, a document that, in the language buried in its 3rd paragraph, gave her discretionary authority over a linked account I hadn't known existed until that morning. I sat across from Margaret, and I looked at those documents, and I felt something that was difficult to name. It wasn't quite surprise, because somewhere underneath everything, I had already sensed the shape of this. It wasn't quite anger, because the anger would come and go in waves, but it wasn't the dominant thing. What I felt most, sitting there looking at my own signature on documents I had signed without reading them carefully enough, was something closer to embarrassment. The particular embarrassment of a man who spent 41 years making sure engines didn't fail, who prided himself on checking everything twice, who had been careful and precise in every professional context of his adult life, and who had let himself be careless about the thing that was supposed to be his security in old age, because he had trusted someone inside his own family. That's a specific kind of pain that doesn't have a clean word for it. Margaret gave me a moment when she could see I needed one. She refilled my tea from the pot on the side table without being asked, and didn't say anything until I looked back up. "How much?" I asked. She told me. I won't tell you the exact number because it's not the point of the story, but I'll tell you it was enough to matter. It was enough to represent something real. Years of modest living, of not replacing things that wore out, of walking instead of taking cabs, of saying no to things I might otherwise have said yes to because I wanted to make sure there was always a cushion. It was enough that when I heard it, I understood that this had never been casual or impulsive on Vanessa's part. This had been deliberate, sustained, and it had required her to look at me, over those 3 years, at dinners and holidays and ordinary Sunday phone calls, and continue. Margaret let the number sit in the air between us for a moment, and then she said, "I want to be clear about something. Every transfer, every document, every communication associated with these transactions has left a record. Digital records, bank records, signed paperwork. The documentation trail is actually quite thorough, which is frankly one of the cleaner cases I've seen in terms of evidence." I asked her what she meant by clean. She said, "I mean that whoever did this kept records, which suggests either confidence or habit. Either way, it works in your favor." I thought about that. I thought about Vanessa, who managed accounts for a living, who had spent her entire professional life surrounded by documentation and record-keeping, who would have known instinctively that you document what you do because documentation protects you. And I thought about how strange it was that the very habit that was supposed to protect her had instead created a paper trail that mapped every single step. Margaret then said something I've thought about many times since. She said, "The most important thing I need to tell you right now, Harold, is that we have not yet determined whether Andrew was aware of any of this." I looked at her. She said, "I'm not suggesting he was. I'm telling you that at this point in the process, I genuinely don't know. The authorizations were submitted in contexts that could plausibly have occurred without his knowledge. He and Vanessa handle their finances largely independently, according to what you've told me. But before you have any conversation with your son, I need you to understand that we don't know yet what he knew or didn't know. And that matters, both legally and personally." I sat with that for a long time. If you're listening to this and you've never had to sit with the possibility that someone you love might have known something they didn't tell you, I hope you continue never having to. It's not a dramatic feeling. It's not the kind of thing that makes you want to shout or put your fist through something. It's quieter than that. It sits in your chest like a stone that isn't quite heavy enough to be unbearable, but that you feel every time you breathe. My son Andrew, 49 years old, an insurance adjuster, which meant he understood risk and documentation and the difference between what was claimed and what was real, who had called me twice in the past 3 weeks and talked about the weather and his work and asked how the clock repair was going, who I had listened to carefully both times, searching for something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. I told Margaret I understood. I told her to keep going. We spent another hour and a half in that office. By the end of it, I had a clearer picture than I'd had of my own financial situation in years, which is its own strange observation, that it took someone stealing from me to make me look at the full accounting of what I had and what had been happening to it. Margaret outlined the next steps with the same calm precision she'd applied to everything else. We would need to request additional records from the bank. She would draft correspondence to Vanessa's legal representation, if Vanessa retained any, or directly to Vanessa herself if she didn't. We would build the complete case document before any formal proceeding. She said again, as she had the first time, that patience was the most valuable thing I could bring to this process. I told her patience was something I had plenty of. She walked me to the door herself, which I appreciated, and said, "I'll be in touch within the week. In the meantime, live your life, Harold. Don't change anything." I walked out of her office and onto the side street and stood for a moment in the November air. The clouds had come back in off the straight, the way they do, and the light had gone flat and silver. A few leaves scraped along the pavement in a gust of wind. I put my hands in my coat pockets and started walking. I want to stop here for just a moment, if you'll allow me, because I know there are people listening to this who are in some version of a situation like mine. Maybe not this exact thing, maybe not money, maybe not family, but some situation where you've been underestimated or taken advantage of, or simply not seen clearly by someone who should have known better. And I want to tell you what I was thinking on that walk, because it matters. I wasn't thinking about what I was going to do to Vanessa. I wasn't planning a confrontation or rehearsing speeches. What I was thinking about was something much simpler. I was thinking about all the people who had told me, over the years, that getting older meant becoming less, that retirement was a kind of retreat from relevance, that the world moved on and you either kept up or you accepted your diminishment gracefully. And I was thinking about how thoroughly I disagreed with that, and how the disagreement wasn't angry, but was very, very certain. I'd spent 41 years making sure things worked, diagnosing problems no one else had spotted yet, staying calm in situations where calm was the only thing standing between a bad outcome and a catastrophic one. Those skills don't retire when you do. They just wait for a moment when they're actually needed. And this was that moment. If you're watching this and you've stayed with me this far, I want to ask you something. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Because the stories we tell here aren't just about what happened, they're about how people found a way through. And I think that's worth more than most things you'll find on the internet on any given Tuesday evening. Hit the subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I've been genuinely surprised by some of the places people find these stories. And if this one is landing for you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Now, back to Victoria. I settled back into my routine with the kind of intention I hadn't brought to ordinary days in some time. There's something clarifying about having a quiet purpose running underneath the surface of your life. I noticed things more. The way the light changed on the harbor between morning and afternoon. The particular sound of rain on the aluminum balcony rail outside my window, which I'd stopped noticing years ago and suddenly found I was paying attention to again. The conversations at the community center, where a man named Patrick kept offering observations about old clocks that I was becoming increasingly convinced were actually about other things entirely. The clockwork helped especially. There's a discipline to restoring an old mechanism that forces you to slow down in a very specific way. You can't rush it. You can't force a part that isn't ready to move. You have to understand the system as a whole before you touch any individual component, because everything is connected to everything else in ways that aren't always immediately obvious, and an impatient adjustment in the wrong place at the wrong time will undo work that took hours to get right. I thought about that in relation to what Margaret was doing, to what I was doing, in my own way, simply by continuing to live quietly while the picture became clearer. I had coffee twice at Mocha House that week, instead of once, which was an indulgence I allowed myself. There's a table by the front window that I like, where you can watch Government Street and the edge of the harbor beyond it. And I sat there on a Thursday afternoon with my cup and watched the November world go past. A pair of older gentlemen playing chess at the next table, a woman reading something thick and serious, occasionally making notes in the margin. The normal, unhurried life of a city that doesn't need to impress anyone. It occurred to me that morning, sitting there, that Vanessa had made a fundamental mistake beyond the obvious one. The obvious mistake was taking money that wasn't hers. But the deeper mistake, the one that was going to matter more in the end, was her assumption about what kind of person I was. She had looked at me, at my quiet apartment and my modest pension, and my walks along Dallas Road, and she had seen an old man who was already, in some essential way, out of the picture. Someone who could be managed. Someone whose attention could be counted on not to land on the details, because what would an old, retired marine engineer know about financial documentation? Quite a lot, as it turned out. You spend enough years in engine rooms, you develop a very fine sense for when something is running the way it should, and when something is subtly wrong. The sound of it, the feel of it, the way certain numbers don't add up to what they're supposed to add up to. I'd felt it for longer than I'd admitted to myself. Small things over the years, a statement that didn't quite match what I'd expected, an explanation from Vanessa that was slightly too quick, too smooth, too already prepared, the particular ease with which she'd navigated certain conversations about money, steering them gently toward conclusions that I'd accepted, because I hadn't had a reason not to. Not yet. That's another thing about getting older that nobody warns you about. You get better at recognizing patterns because you've seen more of them. The disadvantage is that sometimes you start to doubt the pattern recognition itself, to assume that your uncertainty is age, when it's actually instinct. My neighbor Clarence knocked on my door that Thursday evening with a container of soup his wife had made. She always made too much. He always found an excuse to redistribute it, and I had long ago stopped pretending I didn't appreciate it. We sat in my kitchen for an hour, Clarence and I, talking about nothing consequential. He'd worked for the provincial government for 30 years, in records management, and he had that quality that long careers in administrative work sometimes produces, a deep comfort with patience, with process, with the understanding that things happen in their own time, and the best you can do is keep the documentation straight. I didn't tell him what was happening, but I was glad he was there. By the time Margaret called again, 10 days after our second meeting, I had reached a particular kind of steadiness that I can only describe as the feeling of having fully accepted the truth of a situation without yet knowing its outcome. The money was gone, at least for now, at least from where it was supposed to be. My son might or might not have known something I needed to know. There was a case being built methodically and honestly by a woman who knew her work, and it would take the time it needed to take, and none of my worry or impatience would change that timeline by a single day. So I stopped worrying, not because the situation wasn't serious, but because I've lived long enough to know that worry is the least efficient use of whatever energy you have left. Margaret's call came on a Wednesday morning while I was getting ready for the community center. She said she had been in contact, through a carefully worded initial inquiry, with Vanessa's financial institution. She said the response had been more revealing than she'd expected, and that she wanted to talk about how Andrew fit into what was becoming a more complete picture. I asked her if the news about Andrew was good or bad. She paused for just a moment, long enough that I noticed it, and said, "I think it's complicated, Harold, and I think it's going to require a conversation that will be harder than the legal portion of this." I said I'd be in the next morning. After I hung up, I stood in my hallway for a moment with my coat half on. Through the window at the end of the hall, I could see a slice of the harbor, just a narrow strip of gray-green water between the buildings, a faint line of the far shore beyond it. A small piece of the view I'd been waking up to for 5 years. I thought about Andrew, about his voice on the phone those 2 weeks earlier, easy and familiar, about the particular quality of his silences, which I knew as well as my own, because I'd been listening to them since he was very young, about what Margaret had said, that it was complicated. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in the very quiet place where things settle when you've been turning them over long enough, something began to shift. Not toward anger, not toward fear, toward something harder to describe, toward the recognition that whatever was coming next wasn't going to be about money at all. It was going to be about what my son and I actually knew about each other, about what had been said and what had been left unsaid, carefully, for longer than either of us probably realized, and about whether the truth, when it finally came out into the light, was something we were both going to be able to bear. I've been asked, a few times in my life, what the hardest thing about getting older actually is. People expect me to say the body, the knees, the back, the way a flight of stairs becomes a negotiation instead of a reflex. And sure, all of that is real. But the honest answer, the one I never gave in polite conversation, because it doesn't land well at dinner tables, is this. The hardest thing about getting older is learning to hold two completely opposite feelings about the same person at the same time, without letting either one destroy the other. I walked into Margaret's office the next morning, carrying that exact problem. The weather had turned properly cold overnight, the kind of cold that comes in off the Strait of Juan de Fuca and settles into the stone of the older buildings along Government Street, the kind you feel in your hands before you feel it anywhere else. I'd worn the Aberdeen coat again and my good leather gloves, and I'd walked rather than called a cab because I needed the movement. 20 minutes from Montreal Street through James Bay, past the small gardens that the residents keep along the side streets. Most of them cut back now for winter, but still tidy, still tended, which I always thought said something decent about a neighborhood. Margaret's assistant had tea ready before I sat down. I was becoming a regular. She came in, closed the door, and sat across from me with the file open and her reading glasses already on, which told me she'd been working on this before I arrived. I liked that about her. She didn't perform preparation. She simply arrived having done it. She said, "Before I tell you what I found, I want to ask you something. In all the conversations you've had with Andrew about your finances over the past 3 years, and I mean any conversation, however brief, however casual, did he ever ask you specifically about your monthly balance? Not about your general situation, but about the specific number?" I thought about it carefully, because that's a specific question, and specific questions deserve careful answers. And I realized, sitting there with my tea getting warm between my hands, that yes, he had. Twice that I could clearly remember, and possibly a third time that was hazier. He'd framed it casually, the way you might ask an elderly parent whether they have enough to be comfortable, but the question had been specific. Not, "Are you doing all right?" but, "What are you working with these days, roughly?" The kind of question that has a right answer and a wrong answer, depending on who's asking it and why. I told Margaret that. I told her as precisely as I could. She wrote it down. Then she said, "I need to show you something." What she put in front of me was a series of email exchanges. They had been obtained through a formal legal records request, the kind that takes time and the right paperwork and a lawyer who knows exactly which forms to file with which institutions. The emails were between Vanessa and a financial services address, an account linked to an investment management service she used professionally, but the content of two of them included Andrew's name, not as a recipient, as a reference. Vanessa had written to someone at the service explaining that, "My husband is aware of the arrangement with his father, and that Andrew has confirmed the family situation is stable." That phrase, "the family situation is stable." I read it 3 times. Then I put the page down on the desk and looked out Margaret's window at the gray November street outside. The family situation is stable, written in reference to my finances, my monthly pension, the modest, carefully managed life I had been living in my apartment on Montreal Street, watching the ferries cross the harbor and walking Dallas Road and fixing other people's broken clocks, because I needed somewhere to put the patience I'd spent my whole life building. Margaret let me sit with it. She was good at that. She didn't rush to interpret or soften or explain. She just let the silence do what silence needed to do. After a while, I said, "Does this mean he knew?" She said, "It means he may have known something. Whether he knew the full extent of it, whether he understood what was happening as it was happening, or whether Vanessa gave him a version that was incomplete enough that he believed he was being told the truth. I genuinely can't determine that from this alone. What I can tell you is that his name appears in documentation connected to these transactions, and that changes some things about how we proceed." I asked her how it changed things. She said, "It means the conversation you eventually have with Andrew needs to happen in a context where he can't later claim he had no opportunity to respond. It means we need to be careful about the sequence of events, and it means—" She paused here. "That you should prepare yourself for the possibility that Andrew's understanding of what happened and your understanding of what happened may be genuinely different. Not because he's lying to you, but because people can participate in something without fully understanding its shape." I thought about that for a long time. Here's the thing about Andrew that you need to understand. He's a good man. I mean that in the straightforward way, not the way people say it when they're trying to find something charitable to offer about someone difficult. He's genuinely decent. He works hard. He's honest in his professional life in a way that I know because I've watched how he talks about his work, the care he takes, the discomfort he expresses when a claim doesn't sit right with him morally, even if it's technically payable. He didn't get that from nowhere. But Andrew also has a quality I recognized because I watched it develop over decades. He trusts the people closest to him in a way that doesn't leave much room for doubt. He decided, a long time ago, that Vanessa was competent and honest, and that her management of their shared life was something he could rely on without examining too closely. That's not weakness. That's the arrangement a lot of marriages run on. You divide the responsibilities, you trust the person who took on the ones you didn't, and you get on with the parts you did take. The problem, of course, is when the person you trusted in that way makes decisions you didn't actually authorize, and perhaps never would have. I left Margaret's office with a different kind of weight than I'd carried out the previous 2 times. Not heavier, exactly. Different, more complicated in its distribution. I walked down to the harbor and sat on one of the benches along the inner harbor walkway for a while, even though it was cold enough that I was the only one doing it. The tourists had gone. The buskers hadn't come out yet. A float plane was coming in from the north, dropping low over the water in that particular way they do, the engine changing pitch as it descended, and I watched it land and slow and pull toward the terminal, and I thought about my son. I thought about who he'd been at 25, at 30, at 40. I thought about the first time I met Vanessa, at a dinner Andrew organized specifically to introduce us, and how I'd liked her, actually liked her, genuinely, not just because she was Andrew's choice, but because she was sharp and confident, and had a way of taking charge of a room that seemed to make Andrew more comfortable, rather than less. Eleanor had liked her too. She'd said afterward in the car going home, "She'll keep things organized." And we'd both laughed, because it was true, and because it seemed like a good thing. I wondered what Eleanor would make of all of this now. Probably she'd say something that cut right to the center of it in about 12 words. She had that gift. I got up from the bench and walked home, and I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Andrew, not to tell him anything. Not yet. That wasn't the right moment. And I understood now, more than ever, that timing mattered in ways I couldn't afford to be careless about. I called him the way I always called him. To talk, to hear his voice, to sit with the knowledge I was carrying and listen to whether there was anything in his voice that I'd missed before. He picked up on the second ring, which he usually does. He asked how I was. I said fine, cold, the usual. He laughed and said they'd had frost on the car that morning out in Saanich. I asked about his work. He talked for a few minutes about a claim that was giving him trouble, a commercial property situation, complicated liability questions. And I listened, actually listened, the way you listen when you're paying attention to two conversations at once, the one being spoken and the one underneath it. He sounded like himself, which was either reassuring or the most complicated thing in the world, depending on what he knew. When we hung up, I stood in my hallway for a moment, in the same spot I'd stood before, with the same slice of harbor visible through the window at the end. And I decided something. I decided that regardless of what Andrew had or hadn't known, regardless of how this turned out in legal terms, I was not going to approach my son as though he were a suspect. I was going to approach him as my son, because that's what he was, first and before everything else. And because the alternative, treating him with the same arm's-length caution I was maintaining toward Vanessa, would do a damage to our relationship that no settlement agreement would ever repair. I was going to trust him until the evidence told me clearly that I couldn't, and I was going to do it with my eyes open. Now, something happened around this time that I haven't mentioned yet, because I was getting to it. About a week after that visit to Margaret's office, I was at the community center on a Tuesday afternoon, working on a Gilbert mantel clock that someone had brought in with a broken suspension spring. It's delicate work. The suspension spring is one of the most fragile components in a mechanical clock, and replacing it requires a steadiness of hand that I'll admit has gotten harder to maintain over the years, but is still, on a good day, something I can manage. Patrick was at the table across from me, working on something with a hammer that seemed to require considerably less finesse than what I was doing. We'd been working in comfortable silence for about 20 minutes when he said, without looking up, "You seem different lately." I said, "How so?" He said, "More settled, like you've decided something." I thought about that. "Maybe I have," I said. He nodded, still not looking up. "My father used to say there's a particular kind of peace that comes when you stop fighting the fact that something has to happen and just start making sure it happens right." I put down the tool I was holding. "Your father was a smart man." Patrick shrugged. "He fixed radios, said the principle was universal." I've thought about that exchange more times than I can count since then, because it was true. Somewhere in the week since Vanessa's phone call, I had moved from the shock of the thing to the management of it, and in making that shift, I had found a kind of clarity that I don't think I could have manufactured on purpose. It had to arrive on its own schedule. And if you're out there watching this right now and you're in the middle of something that hasn't settled yet, something where you can see the shape of what needs to happen but can't quite get there, I want to tell you that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is exactly what I was doing. Keep showing up. Keep doing the ordinary things with ordinary care. Let the work be done by people who know how to do it, while you hold steady. That's not passivity. That's a discipline, and it's harder than it looks. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we tell a lot of stories here and not all of them are mine. But they all have this in common. They're about ordinary people who found something in themselves when it mattered. That's worth your time. The subscribe button is right there. Margaret called again in the third week of November. She had completed the formal records request with the bank and had received a comprehensive transaction history going back 40 months. What it showed was the full scope of what had been happening. Not just the transfers I'd already known about, but a secondary pattern she hadn't flagged yet, because she'd wanted to confirm it with a second source before bringing it to me. It turned out that some of the transfers had gone through an account that was nominally joint, an account I had technically authorized, years earlier, in a conversation I now remembered as being about something entirely different. Vanessa had opened the account under the description of a family emergency fund, and I had signed the paperwork without fully registering what the terms meant, because the conversation around it had been framed as being about helping Andrew if something unexpected came up. I had signed paperwork to create a fund that I thought was for my son, and that fund had become a channel. When Margaret told me that, I sat very still for a moment, and then I said, "She used Andrew's name to get me to sign." Margaret looked at me carefully. That's one interpretation. It's also possible that was the original intent, and it evolved into something else. I can't determine intent from documentation alone. What I can say is that the account's usage does not reflect the stated purpose. I nodded. And Andrew? There's no evidence he accessed the account directly, she said. Whether he knew it existed in this form is something I still can't say with certainty. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I had to. The possibility that my son's name had been used, genuinely, without his full knowledge, to make me more willing to sign something I otherwise might have questioned. That the thing that had made me trust the paperwork was the thing I trusted most, my son. That was, I think, the moment I felt something closest to anger. Not the hot, immediate anger that passes quickly. The cold, deep kind. The kind that doesn't shake your hands but settles in your chest and stays there, very quiet, for a very long time. I walked home from Margaret's office that afternoon through Beacon Hill Park, even though it took longer and the cold was proper by then. Real November cold, the kind that strips the last pretense off the trees and leaves everything bare and honest. I walked past the pond near the center of the park, where in summer there are ducks and people throwing bread, and a general sense of uncomplicated pleasantness, and which in November has a gray, still dignity that I actually find more beautiful. Things don't pretend in November. They just are what they are. I sat on a bench near the rose garden, where nothing was blooming, obviously, just the bare structural canes tied back for winter, and I sat there long enough that I got genuinely cold. I didn't mind. Sometimes you need the cold to think straight. It removes distractions. Here's what I was thinking on that bench. I was thinking about the mechanics of trust, about how it works, structurally, the same way an old clock works, through a series of interlocking dependencies, each one relying on the one before it, the whole system only functional if every component is doing what it's supposed to do. Remove one piece, bend one tooth on one gear, wear down one pivot beyond its tolerance, and the whole mechanism stops keeping accurate time. It might still run. It might still look fine from the outside, but it won't be right anymore. And the longer you leave a damaged mechanism running, the more wear it puts on the parts around the damaged one, until the problem that started small becomes something much larger than the original fault. I'd been running with a damaged mechanism for 3 years. The question now was whether the surrounding parts could still be restored, or whether too much secondary wear had accumulated. I thought about Andrew. I thought about whether a man could live inside a situation he didn't fully understand, close enough to it that he should have seen something, and still be telling himself a genuine truth when he said he didn't know. I thought about how good people can be at not looking directly at the things they're most afraid to see. I know something about that. I've done it myself, not with money, not with anything like this. But I've had moments in my life where I chose the interpretation that didn't require me to do something difficult, and called it reasonable rather than convenient. 41 years working on vessels, you see men make that choice in situations where it matters enormously. The engine is making a sound. You can call it nothing, because calling it nothing means you can stay on schedule, or you can call it what it actually is, which means you stop and investigate and potentially delay the departure and face consequences for the delay. Most of the time, the sound really is nothing, but the times it isn't, you want to be the man who stopped. I hoped Andrew had been, in his own life, the man who stopped. I wasn't yet sure. By the first week of December, Margaret had assembled what she described as a complete preliminary case document. 40 months of transaction history, 3 signed authorization forms, each with specific inconsistencies between the stated purpose and the actual usage, a series of email exchanges that placed Vanessa's awareness of the situation beyond any reasonable claim of accident or oversight, a formal accounting of the total diverted from my monthly deposits over the course of the documented period. She called and asked me to come in. She also said, and this was new, that she was recommending we consider initiating a formal civil mediation process rather than going directly to litigation. She explained why, that mediation, in cases like this, tended to produce faster and more durable outcomes, that it avoided the costs and unpredictability of a courtroom, and that it gave all parties an opportunity to respond to evidence in a controlled environment before any judge was involved. She said one more thing before we hung up. She said, "Harold, before mediation begins, there's a conversation that needs to happen, not with Vanessa, with Andrew, and I think you need to have it before he hears about any of this from her." I said I knew. She said, "How are you feeling about that?" I thought about it honestly, and then I said something I hadn't entirely planned to say, something that came from wherever the truest things come from when you've been carrying them long enough that they find their own words. I said, "I'm not afraid of the conversation. I'm afraid of what it might show me about how well I actually knew my own son." There was a brief pause. Then Margaret said quietly, "That's the most honest thing a father can say." We said goodnight. I made myself dinner, nothing elaborate, soup and bread, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter looking at the harbor in the dark, the lights of the Coho Ferry terminal reflected in the black water below. Then I washed up, dried my hands, and picked up my phone. I scrolled to Andrew's name. I looked at it for a while. Then I put the phone face down on the counter and went to bed. Because some conversations need a morning. They need the light to be right, and your voice to be steady and your mind to be clear. You don't have the conversation that could change everything at 10:30 on a December night when you're tired and the harbor is dark and you're not yet sure what you're going to say. You sleep, you wake up, you make coffee, you watch the first light come over the water, and then you call your son. I called Andrew at 8:15 on a Thursday morning in the first week of December. The light was doing what I'd waited for, coming in low and pale gold over the harbor, the kind of winter light that makes everything look considered, and still, like the world has taken a breath before the day properly begins. I'd made my coffee. I'd stood at the window for a few minutes, watching a heron on the breakwater, completely motionless in the cold, doing what herons do, waiting with a patience that makes human patience look amateur. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, put my cup on the mat Eleanor had bought at a craft market in Sydney years ago, and I called my son. He answered on the third ring, slightly surprised the way people are when a parent calls on a weekday morning, not alarmed, just adjusting. "Dad," Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I need to talk to you about something, though, in person. Can you come to Victoria this weekend?" A pause, not a long one. "Yeah, of course. Saturday work?" "Saturday works," I said. He asked if I was sure everything was okay. I told him I was sure, that there was just something I needed to go through with him properly, face to face, and that it was important enough that I didn't want to do it on the phone. He said he understood. He said he'd be there by 10. When we hung up, I sat with my coffee for a long time. I want to be honest about something here. In the weeks since Vanessa's phone call, I had thought about this particular moment more than any other, more than the legal proceedings, more than the mediation, more than the final accounting. Because all of those things were, in some essential way, external to me. They existed in offices and documents and processes that Margaret would navigate with competence and care. But this, sitting across from my son and telling him what I knew, and watching his face as he understood it, this was mine alone to carry. No lawyer could do it for me. No process could make it easier. It was just a father and a son and the truth between them, which is the oldest and most complicated territory in the world. Saturday came in cold and clear, one of those Victoria winter days that reminds you why people choose to live here despite the rain. The sky a hard, clean blue, the harbor glittering under it, the Olympic Mountains visible across the strait in that sharp-edged way they only get when the air is cold enough to make everything precise. I'd made a proper pot of coffee and bought good pastries from the bakery on Government Street the morning before, which I put on the table in a way that felt right, without feeling like I was staging something. Andrew arrived at 10:05. He looked like himself, a little tired around the eyes the way people in their late 40s often do on Saturday mornings, still wearing his practical outdoor jacket, the one he'd had for years and refused to replace because it still worked fine. He came in and looked around the apartment the way he always did when he visited. That quick instinctive scan that I'd come to understand was his way of checking that things were in order, that I hadn't let anything slip, that the place was still being looked after. It used to mildly annoy me. That morning I found it almost touching. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee and I didn't make him wait long. I've never been the kind of person who builds to things through 40 minutes of warm-up conversation. It's not kindness, I think. It's more like a form of respect. If something matters, you say it. I said, "Andrew, I need to tell you what's been happening with my finances over the past 3 years, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything. Can you do that?" He looked at me carefully, set his coffee down, said, "Yes." So I told him. I started at the beginning, the first Friday of November, the balance that dropped, the phone call from Vanessa. I told him what she'd said, word for word. I watched his face when I said it, watched the small changes that moved across it like weather, confusion first, then a tightening around the eyes, then something harder to name. I told him about Margaret. I told him about the records request, the authorization forms, the 40 months of transaction history. I told him about the emails that referenced his name. I told him about the account that had been opened as a family emergency fund, how I'd signed the paperwork, how I'd done it because she'd framed it as something for him. I didn't editorialize. I didn't add anything beyond the facts as I knew them. I laid it out in order, the way Margaret had laid it out to me, because I'd learned from her that clarity was the most respectful thing you could offer someone who was about to receive something difficult. When I finished, there was a silence. Andrew's hands were around his coffee cup, but he wasn't drinking from it. He was looking at the table, and I watched something happen in him that I recognized, because I'd felt a version of it myself. The particular quality of silence that happens when your mind is trying to reconcile two versions of something that cannot both be true. The version you believed, the version you're being shown. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful in the way that told me he was managing something. "Dad, I knew she was helping you with some paperwork. She told me you'd asked her to help streamline things. She said you'd found some of the banking stuff confusing. I said, very quietly. I didn't ask her, Andrew. He looked up. I said, I never asked her to help with anything. That conversation didn't happen. The silence that followed that was different from the first one. Longer, heavier. The kind of silence that reconfigures things. Andrew put his coffee cup down. He looked at me, and I could see the exact moment he stopped trying to find the interpretation that made everything make sense, and simply accepted that it didn't, that it wasn't going to, that the thing I was telling him was the thing that had happened, and the story he'd been told was not. He said, She told me you'd brought it up. She said you were worried about managing it yourself. I said, I wasn't worried. I was managing fine. He ran a hand across his face. He's had a habit of doing that since he was very young, when he's processing something that isn't settling easily. I've watched him do it since he was in his 20s. It means he's genuinely thinking, not performing thought. I was glad to see it. How long? He said. About 3 years of documented transfers, I said. Margaret has the full accounting. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said something I hadn't fully expected. He said, I should have looked more closely. I should have asked more questions. I said, Andrew. He said, No, I should have. I knew she was helping with some of your accounts. I didn't ask what that meant specifically. I didn't look at it. I trusted her to be doing what she said she was doing, and I didn't check. He stopped. That's on me too, Dad. That's not just on her. I want to tell you about that moment, because I've thought about it many times since. My son, sitting across my kitchen table on a Saturday morning, taking responsibility for his own failure of attention in a situation where he could have, with some justification, positioned himself purely as another person who'd been deceived. Instead, he did the harder thing. He acknowledged what his own easy trust had cost, without making that acknowledgement a way of centering himself in a situation that wasn't primarily about him. I was proud of him. Even in that moment, with everything that was happening, I was genuinely proud of him. I said, I'm not asking you to take responsibility for what she did. That's hers. What I need from you now is to understand the full truth of it, and to be part of whatever comes next in the right way. He said, What does that mean? What comes next? I told him about the mediation process Margaret was recommending. I explained it as she had explained it to me. Calm, civil, documentation-based, aimed at a full financial settlement rather than a criminal prosecution. I told him I wasn't interested in destroying Vanessa. I was interested in having what was taken returned, and having the record show clearly what had happened, so that it was never a matter of debate. Andrew listened to all of it. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and looked out the window at the harbor, which was doing its beautiful winter thing in the morning light. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, She's going to say she thought it was authorized. She's going to say it was a misunderstanding. I said, She might. Margaret is prepared for that. He said, Will it work? The mediation? I said, Margaret thinks so. I trust her. Andrew nodded slowly. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, in a way that felt like the first fully unguarded thing he'd done since he'd walked in the door. And he said, Dad, I'm sorry. I don't mean about the legal part. I mean that I didn't see this, that I was living close enough to it that I should have seen something, and I didn't. I said, I know. He said, That's not enough, but I mean it. I said, I know that too. We sat together for another hour after that, drank more coffee, talked through things in a way we hadn't talked through things in years, the kind of real conversation that tends to happen only when something has broken open a space for it, when the ordinary surface of daily contact gets pulled away, and you find out whether there's something underneath worth keeping. There was. There was more than I'd been sure of in the weeks of uncertainty. When he left, he stood in the doorway for a moment and said, I need to talk to her, I said. I know. Margaret needs to be notified before anything formal happens. But the conversation you have with her in your own home, that's between you and your wife. I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to be honest. He said, I will be. I believed him. Now, if you've been listening to this and you're wondering what happened between Andrew and Vanessa in the days that followed, I can tell you only what I know. I wasn't there. Andrew didn't give me a detailed account, which I respected. What I know is that Vanessa retained a lawyer of her own within 4 days of that Saturday morning, which told me that Andrew had told her the full truth of what I'd shared with him, and that she understood it was serious. Margaret received notice of legal representation and moved forward with the mediation scheduling. The process took another 6 weeks to arrange, finding a mutually acceptable mediator, establishing the documentation package, ensuring both legal teams had reviewed everything in advance. During that time, life in James Bay continued at its ordinary pace. I want to tell you about those 6 weeks, because I think they matter as much as anything else in this story. I went back to my mornings along Dallas Road. I went back to the community center, where Patrick and I had started working on a beautiful old Vienna regulator clock that someone had brought in from an estate in Oak Bay. An 8-day movement in a walnut case, the kind of clock that was made to last a century and very nearly had. It needed significant work, but the bones were sound. Patrick said it was the most satisfying kind of repair work, the kind where the original maker's craftsmanship was still visible under the damage, still worth honoring. I thought about that more than he knew. I had coffee at Mocha House on my usual days. I talked to Clarence in the lobby and occasionally ate his wife's soup and felt genuinely grateful for both. I walked through Beacon Hill Park in the early mornings, when the frost was still on the grass and the herons were out in the pond, and the whole park had that stripped-down winter honesty that I'd come to prefer over its summer abundance. Things reduced to their essential structure. Nothing extra, just what was real. I did not speak to Vanessa during those weeks. There was no need to, and Margaret had been clear that direct contact between us was inadvisable while the legal process was active. But she was present in her absence, the way significant things are. The fact of what had happened, the 3 years of quiet, deliberate redirection, sat somewhere in the background of every ordinary day, like a low note you stop consciously hearing, but that you know is there. And here is something I want to tell you, something I haven't said yet, because I want to say it right. During those weeks, I thought a great deal about what it means to underestimate someone, about how it happens. Vanessa hadn't underestimated me carelessly or randomly. She'd arrived at her assessment of me through a process that had its own internal logic. She'd watched me live quietly. She'd seen me accept my modest pension without complaint. She'd seen me walk when I could have taken a cab, eat simply when I could have spent more, decline to replace things that still functioned, even when they were worn. She'd interpreted all of that as a kind of passivity, as someone who had made peace with being small. But the truth was something else entirely. The truth was that I'd lived modestly, because I'd worked long enough to understand the difference between what you need and what you think you need, and I'd come down firmly on the side of need. The truth was that the precision and care I brought to my morning walks and my clock repairs, and my careful management of what I had, were not the habits of someone who had given up. They were the habits of someone who had figured out, over 76 years, what actually mattered. And what actually matters almost never requires very much space. The mediation was held on a Wednesday morning in late January, in an office on Fort Street. A clean, neutral room with good light, and a long table and a mediator named David Okafor, who had a calm authority that reminded me of the best senior engineers I'd worked with over the years. The kind of man who has no interest in theater and considerable interest in facts. Margaret sat beside me. Vanessa's lawyer sat across the table. Vanessa sat next to him. This was the first time I'd seen her since November, since before the phone call. She looked composed. She has always had a composed exterior. It's one of the qualities that made her good at her professional work. But there was something different about how she was sitting. A carefulness, a containment, as though she was managing the amount of space she took up. David Okafor opened the session by establishing the ground rules. Calm and factual. Everyone had seen the documentation package in advance. The purpose of today was not to relitigate what had happened, but to determine a path to resolution. He asked Vanessa's lawyer if his client wished to make a preliminary statement. There was a brief exchange between them, quiet enough that I couldn't hear it. Then Vanessa's lawyer said that his client acknowledged the transfers had occurred and did not contest the documentation. Beside me, I felt Margaret make a very small note on her pad. That acknowledgement, offered at the outset, was significant. It meant we weren't going to spend hours fighting over whether the basic facts were real. What followed was methodical and, frankly, less dramatic than you might expect. Each document was referenced. Each transfer was confirmed. The total was established formally and entered into the mediation record. David Okafor asked clarifying questions with the even-handed precision of someone who has done this many times and has no personal investment in the outcome other than reaching a genuine resolution. At one point, about 90 minutes in, David Okafor asked me if I wished to address the room directly. I said yes. I'd thought about what I wanted to say for weeks. I'd considered several versions. I'd rejected the ones that were too long, the ones that were too pointed, the ones that said more about my anger than about the truth. What I'd arrived at was very simple. I've always found that the truest things are. I looked at Vanessa. She met my eyes, which I'll give her credit for. I said, "The money never hurt me as much as discovering how little you thought my lifetime of work was worth." The room was quiet, not dramatically quiet, just the ordinary quiet of people absorbing something that didn't need elaboration. Vanessa didn't respond immediately. When she did, it was quietly, without the gloss of performance. She said, "I understand that." It was not an apology, exactly, but it was something real. I could tell the difference. The settlement was agreed in principle by the end of that session, a structured repayment arrangement over a period that Margaret and Vanessa's lawyer worked out over the following weeks, terms that were realistic, legally documented, and enforceable. No dramatic gestures, no public statements, no press, just a legal record that said clearly what had happened and how it was going to be corrected. I walked out of that office into the January afternoon and stood on Fort Street for a moment in the thin winter sun. Margaret came out behind me and stood beside me without saying anything, which was exactly right. After a moment, she said, "You did well in there." I said, "I just said what was true." She said, "That's the hardest thing to do, usually." We shook hands. I thanked her. I walked home. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. The payments began arriving on schedule, regular as tides. Andrew and I talked more often than we had in years. Real conversations, the kind that found their way to things that mattered, not just the surface maintenance of keeping in contact. We didn't talk about Vanessa much. That was their marriage to work out, and it wasn't mine to direct. What I knew was that something had shifted between Andrew and me, something that the crisis, in breaking things open, had paradoxically made room for, the kind of room that only appears when the comfortable furniture of assumption gets moved. I don't know how to say this without sounding like I've wrapped it too neatly, so I'll just say it plainly. I was grateful for my son. I was grateful that when the truth came to him, he'd gone toward it instead of away from it. That told me something essential about who he was, that I was glad to know with certainty, rather than just hope. And then, on a morning in late February, one of those Victoria mornings that hints at spring without quite committing, the plum blossoms just beginning on the trees along Cook Street, I came back from my morning walk, pushed through the front door of my building, and nearly walked past a woman on her knees scrubbing the marble staircase. I would have walked past. I was thinking about something else, but something in my peripheral vision registered before my conscious mind did, and I slowed and looked. It was Vanessa. She was wearing work clothes, her hair tied back, with a contractor's badge clipped to her jacket. She had taken on building maintenance work, steady, honest, unglamorous work, while she rebuilt what the settlement had required her to dismantle. She was not hiding. She was simply doing what needed to be done, which is its own kind of dignity. She looked up when she realized someone had stopped. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she said, quietly, with nothing performative about it, "Good morning, Mr. Mackenzie." Not sarcastically, not with bitterness or deflection. Just those 4 words, said plainly, by someone who understood exactly what they were acknowledging in saying them. I looked at her for a moment, and then I nodded. Just that, a nod, and I walked up the stairs and let myself into my apartment. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel the satisfaction that revenge stories are supposed to deliver at the moment of reversal. What I felt was something quieter and more durable than that. Something that was, if I'm being honest, closer to recognition. The recognition that what had just happened on that staircase was more complete than anything a courtroom could have produced. Not because she was cleaning stairs. That's not the point. And if you think it is, I'd ask you to sit with it a little longer. The point was that she had said my name the way you say the name of someone you have genuinely wronged and genuinely know it. Without decoration. Without excuse. That's a rarer thing than people realize. That evening, I put on my coat and walked down to the inner harbor and sat on the bench I like near the water's edge. The February light was going gold over the Olympic Mountains. A ferry was crossing, slow and lit up in the early dusk, cutting a clean line through the water toward the Washington shore. A few other people were out, a couple walking a dog, a man reading on another bench farther along. The ordinary human business of an ordinary evening in a city that just keeps going. I sat there for a while, and I thought about what I wanted to say to finish this. I'm 76 years old. I've worked hard all my life. I've loved people and lost people and made mistakes and corrected some of them, and left others uncorrected, because the moment passed and life kept moving. I've spent 5 years in this apartment, watching the harbor change with the seasons and the light and the tides, and I've learned more from that window than I expected to. Here is what I know. Retirement didn't make me poor. Being underestimated did. And being underestimated is only permanently damaging if you accept the estimation. If you look at the person who has decided you're no longer worth accounting for, and you quietly, patiently, methodically prove them wrong, not out of spite, not out of the need to see them fail, but out of the simple conviction that the truth is worth the effort it takes to establish it, then what they thought of you turns out to be entirely irrelevant. The greatest justice, I've come to believe, is not watching someone fall. It's watching them finally understand the value of the dignity they laughed at. I sat on that bench until the ferry disappeared into the dusk, and the harbor went dark, and the lights of the city came on one by one, reflected in the black water below. Then I got up, put my hands in my coat pockets, and walked home. The heron was back on the breakwater, motionless, waiting. I nodded at him, too, for what it was worth. And that, I think, is everything. If this story meant something to you, if some part of it landed somewhere real, I'd ask you to do one small thing before you go. Subscribe to this channel, because we tell stories here about ordinary people who found something in themselves when it mattered. And there are more of them than you'd think, and every single one is worth your time. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever been underestimated. Tell me what you did with it. I'd genuinely like to know. And if this one moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. It means more than I know how to say properly. It always does.